Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of academic freedom. My name is Gökhan Şen from Faculty of Law, University of Bergen, also Law Transform. Also, for the relevance of this session, I have taken my fair share from the problems of academic freedom that's around the world. I think some 20 years ago, while I was deciding about my career, I made a very cynical calculation. What kind of a job makes me look cool without necessarily having to sacrifice a stable job and income? And I said, okay, being academic is okay. So I will look cool and I will be okay as a career. If I have known what I was doing with my life back then, I just found after the 20 years, I just found myself in the middle of a war. It's like culture war, you can say, or you can say scopus war, whatever you want to call it, but the war in academia is everywhere. And even from most autocratic settings to the most democratic ones, there's a problem. And this stellar group of academics have different experiences. I can start with Conrado, Hübner, Mendes, then from a constitutional lawyer from University of Sao Paulo, Bruce Wilson, a political scientist from University of Central Florida. And then we have Fernando Romani, a PhD student from University of Sao Paulo, who's working on academic freedom. And finally, we will have Cecilia Barreto, University of Sao Paulo again, who will share your very interesting insights about the dilemma between academic freedom and diversity. So we will start with Conrado. You'll have 7 minutes each. Then we will have time for Q&A.
Okay, good afternoon. Thanks, Gökhan. I got involved with the topic of academic freedom first as a sort of new intellectual interest. In the case of Brazil in 2018, or even before, after the impeachment of President Dilma, cases of unordinary violation of academic freedom were starting to increase. In 2018, the electoral period, there were really violent sorts of interference in university debates about the electoral process, etc. But then, I was fortunate to participate in the elaboration of a report commissioned by a think tank in Berlin, the Global Public Policy Institute, to basically describe the situation and cases of violation in Brazil. But then I became more personally involved in 2021, when I myself became a target of some sort of intimidation. I'm still facing two criminal lawsuits by the two most powerful legal authorities in the country, basically. One is the Attorney General, and the other is Justice of the Supreme Court. Both of them appointed by Bolsonaro, and both of them publicly associated and identified with Bolsonarism, so to say. Although they are independent authorities from the formal point of view, they presented criminal claims because of 2 op-ed articles I wrote in a newspaper. I have a weekly column, and I made criticisms against them, against the Attorney General, because he was failing by omission not to investigate so many wrongs of Bolsonaro's government. The Supreme Court Justice, because he basically on the day before of Easter holiday, he liberated at the peak of the pandemic, at the peak number of deaths of the pandemic, he liberated religious ceremonies and the whole agglomeration that it brings about. But anyway, I don't think I have too much to say about my cases, but I'll be happy to respond to any sort of curiosity. I think that my cases are somehow a pretty moderate sort of interference in academic legal lawsuits or criminal lawsuits. And that's what I had to say about my cases. But on academic freedom more generally, I have a few claims, very briefly. First, to see the difference of discussing, assessing, and elaborating on academic freedom in the context of, let's say, with brackets, in context of democratic normality, in context of day-to-day politics. There are many ways of course, there are many sorts of violation of academic freedom, and democracy itself may pose all sorts of obstacles like through managerialism, market-oriented logic that subject research to private gains. There can be violations to academic freedom in the hiring methods by the university, the whole sort of infrastructure of tenure and stability, discrimination, ideological tensions, etc. But the second claim is when violations of academic freedom take place in a context of autocratization, of democratic recession, of deconsolidation, then we are talking about a threat, of course. This applies to every freedom, but a threat of a different sort. And it adds another layer on top of the other. And this other layer actually includes attacks on all important civic freedoms. So it happens fully outside democratic politics, and in a democracy under a serious stress. And in this context, we cannot talk just about academic freedom under pains of losing sight of a broader, interrelated, and consistent phenomenon. We could see the many reports on the quality of democracy and autocratization, which are the countries that are facing and are leading this wave. But my point here is that in those contexts, we need to talk about a bundle of basic civil liberties that are under threat: freedom of expression, press freedom, academic freedom, and artistic and cultural freedom. They are very much interrelated. So the strategies of restraining these sorts of freedom is a consistent, coordinated, and encompassing strategy. And there are three challenges, I think, to address the question. The first is a theoretical challenge. Academic freedom is very under-theorized, and we need to see more clearly what is the difference between academic freedom and freedom of expression, because a very commonsensical knowledge tends to conflate both. There are many commitments and constraints, many more commitments and constraints in the exercise of academic freedom than on freedom of expression, I would say. Academic freedom is not just an individual right, it requires a whole infrastructure that needs to be well conceived and a whole set of protective norms. Academic freedom does not stand alone. So in terms of the theoretical challenges, these are the main points I would like to raise. There is an empirical challenge, which is describing, assessing the gravity and structure of violations and monitoring such violations. The strategies of interfering in academic freedom are of different degrees and targets different sort of subjects. So there is from stigmatization, interference, intimidation, and actual attack. There is a whole spectrum of things that need to be differentiated. And third, and my time is passing, I think we need to think more about the strategies of defense of academic freedom. And my sense, having lived this personally too, is that these solidarity networks and those many manifestos that emerge on the basis of a case, of attack, are very comforting and are very important from an individual point of view. They are also powerful from a political point of view. But at the same time, they are very reactive and defensive. When they come, it's already, the situation is already quite serious. So basically the
Just wrap.
conclusion, the conclusion, we need preventive structures that could promote academic freedom and actually not only help in the case of an individual case, but actually provide us a clearer picture of what academic freedom is about and institutionally protect it. I could say more later, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Conrado. Bruce?
Okay, thank you. First off, I want to say I'm not a scholar of academic freedom. And had you asked me a couple of years ago if I'd ever be talking about academic freedom in a public forum with any sort of valid point to make, I would say absolutely not. Academics, I think, are quite good at hyperbole and crying wolf. But the wolf actually has come to the pen. And in the state of Florida, so in the US, quick caveats, in the US, education tends to be controlled at the state level, and then at the county level for high schools. And it's also split between public and private. So public universities tend to be more under the thumb of elected officials. So in the last couple of years, the governor of our state, DeSantis, who won by a very, very narrow margin, but he launched this blazing attack on various groups, from gays, migrants, and now the latest one has been education. And the premise that he has is that we are there indoctrinating students. And so to prove this point, he's actually mandating a survey. Right now it's optional, apparently it's going to become mandatory at some point, to survey students and to survey faculty, to say, what are your political leanings? I mean, there's not meant to be these sorts of tests in the US. But the goal is to show that students in their first year are more conservative than they are in their fourth year, in which case the intervening variable is us. So we must have done this to them. Not through education, but obviously through indoctrination. So he's attacked the education system at every level in a way that I did not think was possible a couple of years ago. So at the K-12, like kindergarten through high school, they have rewritten the standards for education. And they farmed this out to a religious organization / college in Michigan called Hillsdale College, who wrote these new standards for the state of Florida. There's a private religious college writing standards for a state institution, like for a state. The new standards say things like, and it says what you can actually teach at the elementary, middle school, and high school level. And so what they're learning now is that the Second Amendment has been poorly misunderstood, and that it actually does guarantee the right to an AK-47 or whatever it is that you have a fancy to, and that amendments to the Constitution that deal with religion, speech, are similarly misunderstood. And so you have to teach people that this was a Christian document that was conceived of as a Christian document, and this is what they're learning. So there's a million examples like we could go into, but what I'm suggesting is that by the time they come to the universities, they're already going to be quite ignorant about what is actually there. At the college level, and also the high school level, they said that you can't teach about critical race theory. You can't talk about structural racism. So there are lawsuits right now, one of which a federal judge has actually blocked this particular piece of legislation, saying that, I mean, to do this is an imposition by the state against the freedom of speech of faculty. Right? Now, nobody says that you have the right to say any old tripe you fancy in a classroom, but there's always been mechanisms to correct for that. But what this is saying is that there are things that you are not allowed to talk about. You cannot talk about structural racism. You cannot talk about gay rights or any other minority rights. The new standards at high school actually skip over the whole Reconstruction period, right? So they teach up to the Civil War with this sort of, well, it wasn't really about slavery, and they weren't all bad. The whole Reconstruction period is missing. There's nothing on it. And then as we go on further on, there's all sorts of stuff is missing, but we're not allowed to fill in the blanks. So this is very much sort of like Anastasio Somoza, the dictator of Nicaragua back in the 60s and the 70s, who argued that, why do I need a population that's educated? What I need is oxen. And he's right. What he's getting, for DeSantis, this is what he wants. He wants people to be ignorant, willfully ignorant, about what's actually happening in the world. So what's the impact of this? well, like Conrado mentioned, I mean, I'm not a scholar of this. I don't actually know, but what I do know anecdotally is this has some really, really chilling effects, right? I mean, right now my semester started on Monday and I launched it exactly as I taught it this time last year with the exact same stuff in there. And it has stuff on women's rights, it has stuff on gay rights, it has things about gerrymandering, about structural electoral questions, about how this has all been like manipulated and twisted. So we'll see what comes of this. But I think a large part of this is going to depend on how faculty react. Another example is the governor refused to allow academics to testify on COVID during the COVID pandemic. And so the University of Florida, which was where these super famous, super specialized medical academics were from, he says, no, you can't testify before the state about this. We're not having that kind of information, largely because he had an agenda to pitch about what was actually important for fighting COVID. But what it did is it blocked these academics from being part of the public debate because they challenged the state. And the university president at Florida said, well, if you challenge the state, you're challenging the university, you shouldn't be doing this. It's like, this is all new. This is why I don't think this is hyperbole anymore. I don't think it's crying wolf. I think this is the beginning of something very, very sinister that is going to do this. What else was I going to say? I mean, I could probably stop there. But also one last thing. They allowed students to record faculty without their permission. Well, fair enough, right? I mean, you shouldn't be saying really stupid things in the classroom. Second thing was that they said that in my class, which I teach an online American government class, that they could record that, but I have to have every second week a 1-hour session on American politics, nothing to do with my class, with 300 students, where you know fine well somebody's going to goad you into saying something, and at some point, if you're not careful, you'll say something stupid, and that's what they'll have. Then they'll have the evidence, right? You said this. And so these sort of bits and pieces of policies that I think are being put into place to intimidate faculty and to prevent them from talking about what they're doing. Right now, research hasn't been affected, but I'm quite sure that's the next on the agenda. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for watching the time, and also I'm speechless right now for after what both of you have said. These anecdotes are really alarming for academic freedom and also for democracy in general. And Fernando, maybe you will have some more eyesight, the bird's eye sight to the problem of academic freedom. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to dialogue with you. So thank you so much for that. My speech today will focus in a research group, in a research project that I was part of, conducted by the Center for the Analysis of Liberty and Authoritarianism, which is a Brazilian research institute where Professor Conrado is also a researcher and co-founder. And in this research, we observed some similarities in the performance of autocratic leaders from Brazil, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, and India. And so we are talking here about Bolsonaro, Orbán, Duda, Erdogan, and Modi's administrations, and how these governments attacked 3 areas of political life: so education, public security, and civic space. Now, regarding higher education, we observed that these autocrats, they used 2 main strategies to attack academic freedom. So the first of them was interference in the institutional autonomy of universities. So we can say this is an institutional dimension of academic freedom. And regarding this strategy, we observe 3 different levels of attacks. So the first of them on administrative autonomy. So examples include in Brazil and Turkey, legal changes that attempt and exclude academic participation from the process of choosing and appointing university rectors, and also appointments of political allies who were ideologically aligned to their regimes in another way of getting political and ideological control over universities. Also in Hungary, some regulatory changes, they forced the Central European University to move its activities from Budapest to Vienna. So it's like a main case of this kind of attack. And now regarding the second level of attacks on the didactic scientific autonomy, we have examples such as in Brazil, some rectors, some university rectors, they censor public events holding public universities, events on democracy and constitutionalism, but on the basis that they would have a supposed partisan political approach. In India, the Ministry of Education made some legal changes and demand governmental permission to universities hold international events, and on the basis that they were protecting India's security, national security interests. And now talking a bit of about the third dimension of this kind of strategy, like the financial autonomy attacks. In Brazil, we have examples such as the Ministry of Education threatening to realize budget cuts on public universities that were making political manifestations. And after that was a huge repercussion in media and among scholars. And the Ministry of Education decided to cut the budget of public universities in 30% from all of them, and justifying as a isonomic criteria. And another example of this attack occurred also in Hungary, when a new law transferred the management of public universities to public foundations, and the heads of these foundations were appointed by government. So it's another way of political and ideological control over the budget of these public universities. So these examples, they, as I said, are related to one main strategy, which is the interference in the institutional autonomy of universities. And the second main strategy, which is related to the individual dimension of academic freedom, it's attacks on the individual liberties of scholars. So in that sense, we have the censorship of scholars' freedom of speech, where the government used disciplinary procedures or legal investigations and also lawsuits to censor the criticism of these scholars on media, on social media. And Professor Conrado is an example of this kind of threat. And this occurred not only in Brazil, this occurred in Poland, this occurred in India. And last but not least, another strategy used was the delegitimization of scientific communities. So these governments, these autocratic leaders, they criticize scholars by saying that the content of their research was not scientific. It was like a partisan political research and stuff like that. So that's just a broad picture of different attacks on higher education, different attacks on academic freedom. And as scholars and universities are key actors to democracy, because we produce scientific knowledge, we foster public debate, we also try to oppose to these regimes by resisting. So I just would like to end my speech by saying that we had this space, and we should continue to resist and to think how can we use strategies to fertilize ourselves, and how it's important to know the realities from each place and to get together and think how we can together resist. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernando. We should definitely keep contact. I have a book part coming from Springer, and the relevant part is following your outline regards Turkey, so we should definitely keep contact. And not less interesting, Cecilia will talk about the problems of diversity and academic freedom.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. I study a lot of diversity in anti-discrimination pedagogy, and I will try to create a bridge between what we are talking about, academic freedom, and also about what we talked before about diversity and decolonizing knowledge. So, can academic freedom override demands for diversity in teaching? Can diversity limit academic freedom? How can these tensions be resolved? Even though they seem like only apparent tensions, they can lead to some real problems. And I give an example. Imagine that students made a complaint about a professor in an institutional body of a university. He's a young, progressive person with like a model career. However, his discipline program is composed of mostly male works and practically all white and from the global north. The student body then requested more diversity of works to address the topic. Representatives of diversity commission talked to the professor to hear his side of the history and also to present arguments about the importance of having diversity in bibliography of the course. There would not be any kind of punishment, only dialogue and awareness raising. Even so, the professor was uncomfortable with the conversation. He justified that the works choosing were classics and essential to discuss the central issues of the course, and expressly stated that the choice of the bibliography was part of his academic freedom. The diversity committee informed the student body about the conversation, but the students were also unhappy and dissatisfied because they wanted a more explicit and definitive institutional position. What are the limits to the tension that seem to exist? As to form, what was the best procedure to address the issue without silencing the student demand or intimidating the faculty? As the content, how is it possible to reconcile two concepts that, while not contradictory, were opposed in practice, like academic freedom and diversity? Academic freedom can be conceptualized in different ways, and I'm using it in the John Scott way, which is academic freedom is an ideal, an ethical aspiration. She defines academic freedom as the pursuit of truth, of understanding by credentiated professors and researchers. So it's not applied to students. And the definition that she states is permeated with tensions, and like Professor Tamale said yesterday, some tensions, some binary maybe colonized tensions between power and knowledge, politics and truth, action and thought, which academic freedom attempts to resolve and differentiate. I want to highlight the tension between the regulatory authority of the disciplinary community and the autonomy of its members, whereby such discipline can exclude or unorthodox ideas and threaten critical thinking itself. On the one hand, academic freedom is a strong foundation against authoritarian attacks on diversity. On the other hand, it can also be used as a foundation for maintaining epistemic status quo, which privileges Eurocentric, male, and white education. A fundamental assumption for my analysis is that both academic freedom and diversity are relevant for achieving the purposes of education and for democracy. More than that, both are equally relevant. And I built a matrix of 4 different scenarios involving the academic freedom and diversity, like more freedom and more diversity, that's the utopia. Less freedom and more diversity, it can be polarization. More freedom and less diversity is epistemicide. And less freedom and less diversity is dystopia. And we need to avoid this kind of scenario. When we have the utopia, we can guarantee the academic freedom and both academic freedom and diversity. And the university ensures the highest possible levels of both of them. The university must encompass the freedom to research and teach, free circulation of ideas with scientific rigor, institutional autonomy, integrity of campuses, and also promote diversity between the faculty, the student body, and also pedagogical conceptions. When we have epistemicide, more freedom but less diversity, we can silence some unorthodox ideas and unorthodox scholars, and it can be based just in the diversity, just in the what's called the other, and that's something that we also need to avoid. Yes, the main problem with this kind of exclusion is that generally the criterion for classifying ideas as heterodox is precisely the difference, which who is different. And in most extreme cases, members of social minorities may be, for this reason alone, considered less neutral, less objective. And when we have, we can have also polarization when you have less freedom and more diversity, because we can force people to move to other institutions if they don't comply with the the ethical and the pedagogical way of thinking of that institution. So we can have institutions with different perspectives, but within this institution, there is, if there is no academic freedom, we just have one kind of perspective. Our utopia and actually our dystopia is to have less of them both. And that's something that in some cases we are facing in Brazil, because we have a lot of attacks in academic freedom, as we have already heard from Conrado and from Fernando. And we have also attacks on diversity, on research that regard sexual orientation, gender identity, gender studies, critical racial studies, attacks on affirmative actions, racial quotas that we stated in the universities. And then we are in this place, we need to think really hard what's going wrong and what we can do to not allow this kind of intervention in the universities, and to promote diversity and both academic freedom as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. So we can have questions or contributions. Anyone? I think it's working. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful talks. I have, I think, two questions. The first is about the role that technology plays in the fiscalization of the teacher's speech. Like we know now, the new generation, they are like recording their teachers at the classroom, and then they can edit those speeches and use, I think it's a kind of weapon they are using, like Escola Sem Partido in Brazil, but that has all this other places. And also, like what Cecilia was talking about, decolonizing, and I was thinking about now we have this trend in Brazil that people, that the elites, the sons and daughters of the elite, they don't want to go to college in Brazil anymore, they are going abroad to study, and then they will come back with this colonized knowledge and apply to Brazil. So how do you think about that? And what's the future in this scenario? Thank you.
I think this is a fascinating topic. I want to complexify it further. And I'm speaking from my experience. So someone who wants to exercise academic freedom and is on the diversity front. And yet I confess that I find my job increasingly difficult, even though my students, the students who take my class, there's a self-selection. These are the pro-diversity students. But of course, it's not just diversity, it's critical, it's the Black Lives Matter, it's intersectionality, it's post-colonialism. And of course, we all have a positionality in, no matter how inclusive we try to be, you're always going to be probably leaving someone out. So my question is, and Conrado and I were discussing this over breakfast, but I thought we would share it, is there maybe also a need when we start teaching to kind of articulate these issues? Because it really, you find yourself in a very insecure position to even start talking, even when you're teaching to those who are supposed to be in your camp. So I'm just complexifying this a bit further. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the very interesting, I think very timely panel as well. I think, first of all, just observation in terms of how the different contexts is rightly shared by the presenters differ so much. As a one scholar at risk myself, especially from a country under a dictatorship of 22 years, it looks very different if you're teaching a constitutional law class and you need to be mindful of what you're saying in the class because of people that are there and people that will report you and what the likely consequences of that will be, which comes, as you rightly said, at a very high cost, right? And so I think with regard to that, and then differentiating it with the US context, thanks, Bruce, for that. I'm going to teach a class on critical race theory next week. And it has been interesting, especially in terms of trying to put together the syllabus and some of the critical things I will want to deal with in the classes is a bit tricky. But we, at the university itself, I think we've been having this ongoing conversation about what academic freedom means, right? So for instance, in which there has been discussion about gray areas in terms of if you invite an outsider whose very publicized views are against institutional values, do you invite them? Is that academic freedom, or is the academic freedom in terms of policies and procedures, does it cover that? And then on the other hand, then the university is like, no, but we support academic freedom, especially within the classroom setting. Faculty can say whatever they want, right? And also within the context of the classroom, faculty can also invite people that might have contrary views with the institutional values and beliefs, but that is fine. But if it is a public-facing event, then it becomes problematic. And I think just going back to the earlier question about, especially within a private institution or a private university where you know where the money comes from. So, and they are very much concerned about that and what that means. So I was just trying to think of, or a question with regard to that is, how do we start thinking of that in relation to not just dealing with the gray areas, especially with the issue around DOPS and abortion, and even navigating that with students clamoring for more conversation about abortion, whilst the university really wants it to, for instance, quote unquote, be within the context of reproductive justice conversation versus abortion. Thank you.
By the way, just let me interfere here. I did a very bad job in calculating the time. So we're already up with the time. Can we just steal a couple of? Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
My question will be super quick. I had never heard of the Florida legislation or the survey, and I just pulled up two articles because I had never heard it, and both CNN and Politico sort of said it was false, and the person who posted it on Twitter actually retracted. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, because I'd like to sort of get my own head straight about what actually happened. So.
Good afternoon. I'm curious about how the dynamics you discussed regarding academic freedom sort of figure along as a trend towards almost the commercialization of academic instruction, and the extent to which that academia and university education is almost seen as a business. And certainly this can be we can distinguish between private and public institutions, but the extent to which that now, you know, a professor is a service provider and his students are clients. And as clients, they have particular demands, particular rights, and particular expectations that they see as being fulfilled. And I just wondered how that might figure with.
There's a lot I could say theoretically, but I'll just make a quick point to back up what Bruce said about research. The government's going after research for a while. National Science Foundation, just in the last 2 years, has recategorized its social sciences so that now what used to be political science has been abandoned, and now the two in two categories called accountable institutions and behavior and security and preparedness, so that you can study security, but you can't study politics. And law and social science is being changed from law and social science to law and science. And both of these have strong, so there's standards that whatever is research has to be falsifiable, which is to say that it has to be statistical and epistemologically positivist. So the qualitative work, especially bottom-up ethnography and all those kinds of things, are now much harder to get funded through NSF, which is the primary funding for research that many people, what I do and what many of you would do if you were in the US. So that, and this has been going on for quite a while. And it's what an irony, Republican Congress is demanding that people take science seriously. But you know, but methodology is one of the cutting edges for really narrowing ranges of kinds of research and exchange through ideas.
Okay, well, still that would be really injustice to not to let you speak, but could you please briefly? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, many interesting questions. Of course, on the question on how to theorize about the academic freedom, one basic point of departure is to actually perceive the big difference and the several constraints that academic freedom has. A professor cannot, on the basis of academic freedom, teach or be a flat earther and teach in the classroom to be a flat earther. He cannot, in a medical school, defend chloroquine to tackle COVID, etc. But perhaps as a citizen, he can say something on the basis of freedom of expression. So there's a really clear line, and the main challenge of establishing and institutionalizing the constraints and limits on academic freedom is to build a system of governance that respects the idea that academic community self-regulates itself. So it's not the Ministry of Education, it's not the judge, it's not a prosecutor, it's not the police, but the academic community, the scientific community. And this affects teaching, this affects research, and etc. This is the solid institutional basis for academic freedom in institutional terms.
Okay, there's 6 questions, so yes, no, no, yes, yes, and yes. Just one point though, right? And that is this the way that the laws are written, and this might talk to your point, is that they're very vague. They're designed to be vague because it's meant to put you off balance. You don't actually know what the consequence of this law will be until you do it. Then they will come and explain it to you when you get wheeled out the door. So I mean, I think that is part of the problem, but it's specific enough, and we know the intent of the law. We know why it was written, we know how it was written, we know what the content is, and we know how it can be broadened to be problematic. And like I say, faculty can be quite hyperbolic and crying wolf, but I think in this case, there is something underfoot. And as it goes on, we will see exactly how bad it is.
Oh, there were like a lot of really interesting questions. I will start with the question of Anastasia about the different kinds of demands. Like the institutions can treat the students as clients, as consumers, or not, or like there are like their legitimate demands there. And the way I think of it is that we need to hear the demands because a lot of them are really legitimate, and it's not a problem of clients or consumption of education,